All right, today I'm going to go over my Argo CD deployment. And Argo CD, if you're unfamiliar, is a tool that gets installed in a Kubernetes cluster, which can manage the cluster that it's in, as well as many other clusters for service deployments. Now, there are many different kinds of service deployments, and I'm not going to go through those. The reason that this is important in my lab is I have 6 services that I manage in Argo within my AKS cluster. And I do that so I can do code, let's say, management inside my repository. I store the manifests, Argo grabs them, make sure that they're not delted or changed, right? And then it makes sure that that application looks exactly like it should inside that cluster. I'm going to go through what that looks like, share some of the lab, and then how I've also built this on top of the NGINX commercial Ingress instead of using the NGINX Kubernetes Ingress, which is community supported. So I'm going to jump over. This is Argo. If you're unfamiliar with it, there's great videos on Argo itself, how to get it deployed. I'm going to touch on that a little bit. But in my environment, like I said, I have 6 services that are deployed. And these services also live in the repository. And for me to be able to manage those, I get to manage them as code. And then Argo comes back through and makes sure that they're synced, right? Or they're deleted or they're, created, right? So it gets to go along with that naming structure. So in this case, mine is up and running, but for most people, they need to get it up and running first. And to me, Argo is a crucial part of my Kubernetes deployment. It's the best way for me to manage, let's say, manifests as code. And I like it, but there are many other ones that do something similar to what Argo does. Now, in this case, it's already up, but I want to walk through how I used the NGINX commercial version to sit in front of this, to enable me to access it. The reason I think that that's important and the commercial version is important is because this would likely be sitting in a production level environment. And I don't really want to have a non-production level product sitting in front of a production level product. Does that make sense? So when you go to do your Argo installation, it's going to go over Ingress configurations. Now, because Argo lives inside the cluster, I've got to have an ingress that lets me get to that resource. And depending on what kind of ingresses you're using inside your Kubernetes cluster, they give you many examples, except for if you want the commercial version of NGINX, which is not in here. So there are things for Ambassador, there's things for Contour, Traffic, the platform native load balancers, and then there's one for Ingress NGINX, which is the let's say the ingress that comes with Kubernetes, right? The CNCF NGINX Kubernetes Ingress. Now, this one's great, except for there's no support on it, right? Unlike Traffic or a few of the other ones that have support-based structures. I wanted to be able to use the NGINX commercial version, which would let me do, well, for one thing, have support. And then it would also let me do things like security features if I wanted to do that too. So what I saw in here was this is the ingress kind, right? Now, NGINX from F5 supports the ingress kind and virtual servers and transports. It supports a few different kinds. But some of the security features that I really like are in the virtual server side. So if I'm looking at this one, and this is the SSL pass-through, there's options for 1, and then there's another option for 2, and the second option is actually the one that I'm doing. So if I'm looking through here, and you've never read an ingress, let's say, resource type, or even any kind of Kubernetes resource type, they read pretty human readable. So this is an ingress kind. It's going to, let's say, start at the bottom. It's going to listen on this name, right? It's going to do TLS on this name with this secret. It has a few rules in here. So anything on this name with this path is going to head towards this server. It also has some of the community annotations, which is basically force redirect. And then the backend protocol, which means what's the Argo CD protocol, HTTP, right? Now, when you do the offload version, you have to create 2 resources. And this is something that people forget or just never realized, is that under NGINX, I also have these same 2 resources. So there's the HTTP resource and the gRPC resource. And Argo needs both, especially if you're using a client to talk to it. So in this case, under the gRPC resource, it's gRPC. It's got that gets prepended, right, to the name of which you're going to. It still has TLS, it still has the path, right? But it says that this is going to be a gRPC type. Now, this is the Kubernetes CNCF NGINX. I want to use the commercial one from F5. So I'm going to go over to the F5 resources, and then under VirtualServer, there's a different type of resource. And the VirtualServer resources accept both HTTP and gRPC, which means when I create my resources for my Argo deployment, I'm going to need both of those. And when I set them up on the correct name, I have the TLS, right? And I can do the offload. Now, there were a few other settings that this requires. The first one is in your Argo deployment, you've got to set it to the insecure if you're going to use the Ingress as the TLS offload. Makes sense, right? So mine's set up that way. It's in my Helm deployments for Argo. I'm not deploying Argo with this. I'm showing you how the Ingress resources work. Okay, so now I've got, I know that I'm going to use the VirtualServer and the VirtualServer gRPC, right? So the two different types. So now if I go look at my deployment inside here, so to me, again, Argo is almost a day zero deployment with Kubernetes because that's how I get all my services in there. So under Kubernetes configuration, because this is a configuration set, right? Files, and then under manifests, because I'm going to, this is actually to get me access into the Argo deployment, right? Under manifests is where I keep my Argo manifests. The first one, we're going to work our way back, right? Is the gRPC one. So very similar to the example from the Argo CD documentation deployment, I have a gRPC virtual server instead of an ingress. This type is set to gRPC. And then in here, you can see the very similar logic. Anything for this path, anything for this name, right, goes to the same locations. I don't have to specify things like backend HTTP because of the way that this is set up. It's automatically going to be backend HTTP. So I don't need those annotations to do it. The virtual server actually does it for me. Under the virtual server one for HTTP, here you can see it's, again, very similar. The name that it's going to match on, it's using the same TLS secret that gRPC gets to use. I do have the redirect turned on, which is their best recommendation so that you're not coming in on 80. The port I'm listening on, the paths. And then I've also, because I now have the NGINX features available to me, I've also used an OIDC policy sitting on this. And I use my OIDC more as a multi-factor than as a single sign-on. So in my case, when I go to argo.calalang.net, this first tab, if I have an authorization token, right, from my OIDC flow, then it just lets me through, right? And I just log in like normal. If I don't have that token, then I can't get there. I have to log in to, in my case, Azure AD is my OIDC provider. So I have to go in and then I can get to the page and I can log in. So I can start to add some security features to this. It could be things like on the gRPC one or even on this one, maybe I want to install rate limiting, or maybe I want to install this. Or if I want to get even more particular, I could also turn on the things like the WAF engine, right, and start to block down traffic. So as it goes across, right, I've got the Argo deployment, but I need to be able to get to it. So I need an ingress configuration. Now the ingress configuration in the Argo documentation is not for the commercial version. It's for the Kubernetes version. So what I created based off of the virtual server documentation was two more resource types, the gRPC and the HTTP version of it. And again, it may be that you didn't know that gRPC is available, but there are many services now that require gRPC communication, basically bidirectional communication between some client and the app. So NGINX does do this, and it does do it in Ingress, right? And this gets me access back to this service. Now, I have a few other things turned on in here just for some analytics, which we can go poke at right now. So this status zone on the path and this status zone on this particular one, you can see the status zone changes for both. Inside my NGINX resource, right, because it is the plus version, now I can get some metrics. So I've got metrics for Argo and I've got metrics for gRPC. Now I don't have any clients coming through on the gRPC endpoint, but you can see the clients coming in on the Argo endpoint. And that means that all of this stuff can be harvested, right, off that Prometheus endpoint or just from the API that exists inside NGINX. So to recap, I went down the path because I want Argo installed in my environment. I also want to production level Ingress installed in my environment, and I'm going to demo against that. So I created those two resources based off what were available inside the NGINX side, and I was also able to add some security features for it. All of this stuff is available inside the repository. As always, I wish everyone good luck on what it looks like for the deployment. If you have any questions, right, open an issue, right? Or if you have any recommendations on things that you'd like to see, again, open an issue on that. I wish everyone good luck.